Hi everyone, and welcome to your first lecture. This week I want to talk a bit about rhetoric. This may be something that is new for some of you, or some of you may be familiar with the term if you've taken courses such as political science or maybe one of your communication courses. Either way, we're going to go through what rhetoric is, where it came from. So we're going to head back to ancient Greece to do that. And then we're going to talk about more modern day definitions and then how we apply it today. So you may want to break up some parts of this video. It's going to be a little bit longer. So to start, we want to talk about some common views that people have of rhetoric. And a lot of it is going to be negative connotations. When we're thinking of rhetoric, a lot of people associate that with politicians, and therefore they associate it with political abuse. It's used to deceive the person, obscure the truth, or just dress up language. People look at it as a way to distract the consumer, the user, the reader, of what the real information is. So it's considered very deceitful. Now, we've talked about what rhetoric isn't, and now I want to talk about what rhetoric really is. For that, we're going to start with Aristotle. And for Aristotle, rhetoric is the art of persuasion. So I want you to take notice of two words that Aristotle uses here. He's using art and he's using persuasion. So persuasion, we're talking about persuading someone to do something. And you can see how that would be sort of conceived negatively if we're thinking of something like advertising. We're thinking of an advertiser persuading you to buy a product. That can to some seem deceitful if they're not honest about what it is. But Aristotle is also saying that this is an art. So it's something that another person can learn. They can learn the art of persuasion. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Aristotle in a few slides, but with Aristotle, he believes that it's the art of persuasion, but also that the rhetor must be acting in a moral manner. Now, we also have a definition from Kenneth Burke. Kenneth Burke wrote Rhetoric of Motives in 1950. So we want to think about the time frame that Kenneth Burke was living in. So around 1950, we had just come out of World War II. Some people would say the whole world was on fire. This was impacting a lot of countries, a lot of thinkers, a lot of authors. So this certainly would have had an impact on Kenneth Burke as well. So for Kenneth Burke, the use of language as a symbolic means of inducing cooperation in beings that by nature respond to symbols is his definition of rhetoric. So what does he mean by that? There's two things that I want to point out that we're actually going to talk about in future slides and throughout the course. One is that the use of language as a symbolic means. He recognizes that language is in fact symbolic. And Burke also mentions that he's talking about cooperation. Inducing cooperation means not necessarily getting someone 100% on your side, but maybe you're giving 75%, they're giving 25%. So for Burke, it's not an absolute by any means. Now, those two definitions really provide the scope of what rhetoric is, and you can kind of see 2 points there that its purpose is to persuade, but also to induce cooperation, at least according to Burke. We're going to see that more throughout this presentation. But really, at the heart of these two definitions, there's a couple of critical concepts that still apply to document design, message design, and any type of evaluation that we would do. So we've got audience, image of the subject, what words are being used, how we want the audience to react, and of course we have ethics. So the first is audience, and anything we create, speak, or even write is done with an audience in mind. So for example, in professional organizations, your audience might be your boss. Your audience for a term paper might be your professor. Again, going with the work example, your audience might be a client. It might be someone outside of your company, or it could just be a colleague that you're trying to teach something. And the audience likely has an action that you want them to take, and that's where the persuasion part comes in. You're most likely trying to persuade the audience to take a certain action. Now, the message is also going to evoke an image of the subject, and we evoke the image of the subject by the words that we're choosing to put on the page. And words are really important because we can use them to emphasize. We can give attention to certain words. We can use them to persuade. We can also use them to entertain or delight. And we do all of this with the goal of how we want the audience to react. We want the audience to react in such a way that is positive to us. So, for example, if I work at a company, I might be doing a request for proposal. I might be doing some sort of a submission, and we want the audience to react positively because we want them to choose us. We want to win the client, or maybe if we're in a nonprofit, we want to be the ones that receive the grant money. So really, we're trying to control how the audience is going to react. But then the final thing that's common to all rhetoricians is ethics. And rhetoric does have some moral implications as well. Again, we go back to what I said about the negative view of rhetoric, and that's coming from a lot of the politician side. But as a rhetorician, you want to make sure that you're creating messages that are appropriate to the situation, that you're not setting out to deceive anyone, you're not trying to be misleading. Now, to understand more about rhetoric, we really need to go back in time to ancient Greece, and we're talking about 5th to 4th century BC. And here we're starting out with the Sophists, and that would be around 450 to 400 BC. And the Sophists were a group that traveled around and taught people similar to what our modern day concept of a school would be. And they went around teaching the craft of public speaking, and so that people could become effective public speakers. So they needed to be effective public speakers because Greece was a democracy and there was a public forum. So in order to go to the public forum and be able to persuade people to agree with you, you had to be an effective public speaker. And this was something that, since it's ancient Greece, only men were taught for this, so women did not have a role in this at this time. And then you can see that I said Sophists versus Socrates. And we'll talk more about why it's versus on another slide. But Socrates was really the first famous rhetorician. He brought us the Socratic method. And that's, if you're not familiar with it, it would be where a teacher poses a question and waits for answers, and poses additional questions to try to elicit answers from the audience. So maybe you've had a teacher who has used that approach in the past. You might see it in one of your lectures. So Socrates then had a student named Plato for 428 to 347 BC. And then Plato, of course, had a student named Aristotle. And that brings us back to where the definition is coming from. Also, Aristotle then had a student who was named Alexander the Great. We're not going to go too much into Alexander the Great in this lesson, but it's just something to know in the future. So again, we're talking about the philosophers going from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle, and they're all going to have something a little bit different to say about rhetoric. Now, so what happens in Greece is that we have the Sophists on one side, and then we have rhetoricians like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle on the other side. Now, Plato believed that Sophists use language to obscure the truth, and that rather than winning arguments by the strength of their arguments, they were actually winning arguments by the beauty of language. So that is, it wasn't necessarily the most honest way to win an argument. They were just winning because they were able to influence. And this is going to be a battle that we see fought throughout the centuries. For example, if you take a look at the Renaissance, you had logic as one of the mainstays of education of the educated people. And anything with rhetoric was really dismissed because it was seen as something that was meant to deceive another person. So what Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were all doing was trying to come up with ways of persuading that really didn't involve a moral purpose or empty words like they thought the sophists used. Now, Plato and Aristotle really had differences when they were talking about searching for truth. To Plato was searching for absolute truth. And for Aristotle, he was searching for probable truth. He realized that there could be times when you have doubt, and therefore he had to search for probable truth because he didn't think that you could be 100% certain that there was absolute truth. So that's really what our goal is today in modern day document design. We want to create messages that are probable truths, and those truths are measured by how successful the user is going to be. So we create a message that's something that we consider to be true, it's true as we know it, and something that an audience would also consider as valid. And then that's how we apply the truths that Aristotle is talking about. Now, here I want to talk a little bit about Aristotle's rhetoric. First of all, this wasn't something that was actually written by him. He spoke it, rather. So his students were actually taking notes and writing this down as he was lecturing. So would there be a way to be 100% certain that all of this was Aristotle? No, but we do hope that the students were ethical and moral and documented it as they said they did. So classical rhetoric identifies 3 different arguments, and that's deliberative, forensic, and epidectic. So first we have deliberate, and that has to do with policy and government. And then forensic, think of how you know that term today. Forensic, legal. We're talking about accusation or blame. And then finally we have epidectic, and that it means ceremonial. So think of something like a president being sworn in, the speech that he's giving, or maybe even think of your graduation in the future. There's likely going to be some speakers. That would be more epidectic. It's a ceremonial speech. Now, Aristotle came up with what he calls 5 canons or parts of rhetoric. And he believes that in order to be a good rhetorician, you have to work through these 5 different parts or canons to be a success. So we're going to go through each of those. Most likely this is going to be set up in another video. Screencast-O-Matic only allows for, I think, 15-minute recordings, and we're at 13 minutes right now. So you're probably going to have to go to the next lecture as well. But I first want to talk a little bit about invention. And invention is coming up with elements of the argument. And there's different types, but we're going to talk about 2 types, non-artistic and artistic. So non-artistic is from outside of the rhetor. So think of maybe something like doing an interview or researching in the library, things like that. And then artistic is arguments that are within the speaker or rhetor. And we're going to look at 3 of those. And these terms are important to make note of because we're going to be coming back to those terms again and again throughout the path of this course. It's going to be really helpful when you're talking about different documents and evaluating them. So first we have logos, and that's an appeal to logic or truth. Then we have ethos, which that's an appeal based on the character or the character of the speaker or even the organization. For an example, an organization that has bad press, you may not necessarily trust them. So their ethos is affected when they're trying to deliver a message to you. And then last we have pathos, and this is also